Did you know that ancient historians actually wrote accounts that corroborate the events of the New Testament as well as the immediate aftermath? Actually, in addition, there are writings that corroborate the Old Testament as well. Today we're going to get into these. Hello there, Eric McRae here. In today's video, I'm going to get into texts outside the Bible written by ancient historians, mostly Roman, but of course you have Jewish historian Flavius Josephus as well, that corroborate the events of the New Testament as well as the immediate aftermath with the onset of early Christendom, as it will. And so this is an actually fascinating study to get into. You do want to understand the process, however, that most of these works indeed were maintained by the Christian community. They were copied and recopied and kept throughout the ages for the obvious reason that just the fact they corroborate the life of Jesus. But that's not only it. That Christians since earliest days have always had a fondness for history and establishing a historical record of what kingdom came in what order, who were the kings in what order. So the historian side of the congregations also opted to keep these texts copied for that reason. So we still have copies of these ancient works and copied manuscripts with us today. And it's from them that we get the information about the ancient world of the time. So the first one we're going to look at today is by a man named Tacitus. He's actually a pagan Roman historian from 1st century Rome, and he wrote the Annals of Imperial Rome. And being that he's pagan and has a great fondness, as we would see, for the system of Rome in the very least, if not the emperor himself, that he's not necessarily particularly friendly towards the Christians or towards Jesus Christ in his writings. And so he wrote this. I guess I'll give you a little background before I tell you what he wrote actually. Hold on. So not Flavius Josephus, wrong guy. Tacitus wrote about that there was a big fire in Rome, which he calls the conflagration. And so in the days of Emperor Nero, much of Rome got burned up in a fire. And so a lot of people were actually suspicious of Nero himself, that he had started it. Now, surely there would have been some discussion, and since most people believed in some kind of god or gods at the point, there'd be the idea it's a punishment from God, it's punishment from the gods, plural, this and that, and there'd be back and forth. But the most popular seems to have been that, well, this was actually started by the Emperor Nero himself. And he was apparently a very moody emperor and quite an aggressive character. And so apparently in order to get rid of the accusation that he had started the fire, what Nero opted to do was to accuse another group of starting the fire that was already conveniently disliked or hated by the populace, and that would be the Christians. So Tacitus writes, "But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiations of the gods, plural, did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration, that is the fire, was the result of an order or a command. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated by all for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. So Tacitus is confirming here that you had this sect called Christians, this religious sect. They're not liked by society at the time, and their origin comes from Christus. Christus means the anointed one. It's basically the equivalent of Messiah, which is really just Mashiach. It's the anointed king of Israel, the Messiah. So they come from Christus, and it says Christus was killed. He suffered the extreme penalty, crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilatus, Pontius Pilate. So that does confirm from Tacitus, an outside source, a pagan Roman historian, that Jesus did indeed live in the time of the first century, and he indeed was killed by crucifixion. Now, it actually continues, and here's where it gets really interesting. Tacitus says, "And a most mischievous superstition, Christianity as it were, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, where the first source of the evil was, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular." So obviously Tacitus is not a fan of this Christian testimony, and he's therefore associating it with Rome, who he's also not a fan of, because he thinks they are foolish people who believe in just about anything and popularize nonsense. And so you get the sense reading his writings, he thinks Christian belief is nonsense and or a problem to be dealt with. So Tacitus was not a fan, but what he wrote here is actually amazing. And if you stop to look at it, he says, the Christian religion that was started by Christus, who was killed during the reign of Tiberius by Pontius Pilatus, that religion died out with the death of its leader for a time. Yet suddenly and unexplicably, it revives in Judea and then breaks out and reaches even to Rome. And we would say that this is a powerful text corroborating the resurrection of Jesus Christ, Yeshua Messiah, because what else would be a sufficient explanation for this religion centered on the following of this man who died, for it to die under the pressure of persecution, than to suddenly revive, except that the leader had actually raised from the dead, just as their text said. So this does corroborate the resurrection of Jesus, actually. Now, Tacitus did write a lot more than that. That's not all he wrote. So he continues, he says, "Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who plead guilty." In other words, the Christians got blamed for lighting the city on fire, and so Rome began to persecute and arrest them. It says, "Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted of the Christians, not so much for the crime of firing the city as of hatred of mankind." Now this is fascinating in that they're going after these Christians, and many of the Romans believe Nero started the fire. So Nero's trying to get the people distracted with the Christians, to blame the Christians. And the people are willing to go along with it, even though they kind of believe in the back of their head that Nero's actually the one who started the fire. Not because they care that much about the fire, but apparently they just view Christianity and the Christian message as hatred of mankind, or as hate speech. And that's going back to the first century. So that to me tells me that today's modern problems and languages and the kind of speech bills being passed by our politicians, and this concept of quoting the Bible being hate speech, is an ancient concept that goes all the way back to the Romans and the emperors of the first century. And so it's a very ancient battle, if you will, or a very ancient concept. And so it tells me that the modern politicians who might hold themselves more advanced and evolved than those ancient Romans are actually following the same exact playbook or for the rules of power, so to speak. They're using the same speech mechanisms and the same accusational language, the exact same. So that's fascinating. That's not my focus here, but I think it's important to document. So it does mention the level and the cruelty of the persecution that was unleashed on the first century Christians. The text continues saying, "Mockery of every sort was added to the Christians' deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or doomed to the flames and burnt alive to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired." And so that describes tragically and sadly brutal persecution against the Christian church. Just absolutely brutal, throwing them in the arenas, burning them alive, letting their animals tear them apart, etc. That's exactly what the Romans were into. So that's all documented in Tacitus, and that verifies, or at least corroborates, a great deal of what's reported in the New Testament and what's reported in Christian history about the persecution and the martyrdom that they suffered in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Now, we have another writer. He's called Pliny the Younger, because there's also Pliny the Older, and they must not be mixed up. Pliny, called the Younger, wrote around 110, Common Era, to Emperor Trajan. And in this letter, he was asking him for advice dealing with the Christians in his territory that were viewed as problematic. And so what Pliny had actually had is that some of the Christians were arrested and became a sort of turncoat, if you will. They renounced their Christianity and were aiding and abetting Trajan in tracking down and finding the Christians, and so on and so forth. And but Pliny was having a problem dealing with the Christians because apparently, based on what I can surmise from the text, is that they weren't a very they're kind of a hard people to justify cruelly punishing or arresting, because they're very lawful. So Pliny actually wrote, "They, the former Christians, assured me that the sum total of their error consisted in the fact that they regularly assembled on a certain day." That could be the weekly Sabbath, I would assume, Friday evening to Saturday evening, or else it's a communion gathering, if they were already into the tradition of substituting Sunday for Sabbath, which I'm not a fan of. I believe it's an error, but nevertheless I show respect. If they were already in that tradition at that time, it could be referring to that. It's irrelevant. What's irrelevant is we do know that Christians met at least one day of the week in particular above others every week, and they would recite a hymn. He says, that is, Pliny writes, they, Christians, recited a hymn antiphorally to Christus, as if to a god. In other words, they're worshiping Jesus. They're saying Jesus is God. And they bound themselves with an oath not to commit any crime, but to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, breach of faith, and embezzlement of property entrusted them. After this, it was their custom to separate, then come together again and partake of a meal, but of an ordinary and innocent one. Basically, kind of describing what sounds like oneg. When you meet on the Shabbat, you get the preaching, the teaching, you worship God, and then very often you have the oneg. You go and you eat food together, and you fellowship together with food. And so Pliny actually documents this, and that's pretty big. And you can see the problem here is that these Christians, they're not breaking most of, they're respecting 99.9% of Roman law. They're excellent protectors and guardians of. So what's the issue? The issue is that they are saying Christus is God. They are saying Christus is king. And this is the time when the cult of the emperor was active, and it was punishable by death, except for very rare exceptions that might have been given, say, to the Orthodox Jews who had a more powerful community and presence to get away with negotiating something like that at times, and even then it was shaky, and by 110 not at all but fallen apart. I can give you some background information out of history for those that aren't too familiar. So originally Rome really wanted to defile the Jewish temple, and he wanted that the emperor going back wanted to have sacrifices offered to Caesar, and so the Jewish leadership of the, again, this would be the Pharisaic Orthodox community and the Sadducees, they went through a bit of a bargaining with the Roman leadership, and they managed to win out a system where they would, in the temple, offer sacrifices not to Caesar but to their god for Caesar. And it was kind of like they came to a peaceful negotiation. Now that was, as you will recall, the Second Temple was destroyed by Rome in 70 AD. So the relationship of the Jews and the Romans, it was never like a tight one. It was never, yeah, we'll offer for you but not to you, and then they came to a mutual agreement, kumbaya. No, the amount of messianic uprisings, in other words, other people besides Jesus claiming to be Messiah, and generally Jesus is the only Messiah that didn't try to lead a physical violent revolt but just went around healing and serving people. The others were attempting to lead a physical violent revolt against Rome as against an occupier, and so Roman soldiers were killed, Roman families were killed by Jewish people. And I'm not making Rome to be the good guys, because Rome was oppressive and Rome would kill Jews, abuse Jews, and so on and so forth. And it's like a mutual culture of abusing one another and harming one another and competing one another. It is what it is. All of history has, sadly enough, stuff like this. But what that means is the relationship of Jews and Romans was always very, very shaky, very, very volatile, and it's almost uncertainty. And there was almost a revolt every 15 years or so. A major revolt would occur, and eventually it got on Rome's nerves, but Rome got on their nerves too. So before the background of, say, the 70 AD event where the temple was destroyed, the Second Temple of Herod, Rome got pushy again and tried to push like a golden statue of the Roman eagle, a symbol of Roman, basically saying, we own you, we dominate you, we're superior, we're in control, right in the temple, and also serving as kind of a Roman god and idol. And so obviously the Jewish people, I don't know if that's the key event provoking the revolt, because it's just, maybe it's a cherry on top of the cake, but Josephus wrote that they tore down that eagle, and then revolt broke out, and then more fighting broke out, and it's, again, there were many uprisings before that, and so Rome decided they had enough. They sent Titus. Titus brought in the Arabic regiment, and they just destroyed the temple, the Second Temple. That was in 70 AD. So Pliny here, Pliny the Younger, he's writing in 110 CE. That's quite a long time after the destruction of the Second Temple, right? So at this point, most of the Jews have been utterly dispersed out of Judea. The Orthodox community's pride has been somewhat stomped on, if you would say. They are, some time has passed, obviously, about, say, 40, 50 years is passing. They're repopulating because millions died in the battle. So, getting back to the point, I actually don't know if at this time Jews and Romans had any mutual understanding at all. And because there's also the Bar Kokhba revolt, which occurs later. I believe it occurs, if I recall correctly, it occurs after this. I think it's around 130 or something like that. I'll pop that on the screen and double check that. But so I don't know if they had a great peace agreement during this time, but the Christians definitely were not protected. If you believed in Messiah Yeshua, Jesus, the cult of the emperor had the understanding you will pay worship as to a god to the Roman emperor, or you are liable to the death penalty. Maybe emperor might say, yeah, I'll let him slide. He doesn't have to worship me. But then if he does that, all his other worshippers might start demanding that. So maybe they might let you live on occasion, but generally Rome is going to crack down that you're not worshiping their human leader. And so Christians were in that situation, as Pliny points out, that they refuse to worship your human leader. They refuse to, but they're doing good. They are a productive people. They work hard. They make money. They pay their taxes. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. They avoid breaking laws. And so Caesar's having a hard time figuring out, or his people, what to do with them, because it's just this one thing they have an issue with, but they typically elect to make an example out of them. And so Pliny, he's a secular writer, and that's how he wrote. Now let's get to Suetonius. Suetonius, in the 5th volume of Lives of the Caesars, the Roman historian refers to the expulsion of Jews from Rome during Claudius's reign in 49 Common Era. Written around 120 Common Era, AD more or less, he notes that Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome since they were always making disturbances because of the instigator Chrestus. Now, Chrestus is spelled differently in this work from Christus. It's likely that Chrestus is indeed referring to Christus, or Jesus Christ. Chrestus, spelled differently, was a popular name among the Greeks, but it was not known to be common among Jewish people. And since he's talking about the Jewish expulsion, it's unlikely there's a big drama going around a person with the Greek name Chrestus. But Christus, then it's understood that Christus just means anointed one. It means Messiah, Mashiach. And so it's quite likely this is just kind of a Greek mishap around Christus because of a lack of familiarity with Jewish culture and how they used the Greek words. Jews were expelled. He documents this around riots pertaining to Chrestus. And the reason that's important is because in the Bible, in the book of Acts, chapter 18, verse 2, Luke, who wrote it, reports that the Jews in Rome were expelled by Claudius on account of riots that took place breaking out because of the preaching of Yeshua the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So that's a perfect one-to-one causal relationship here. You could stumble over the fact that it's Chrestus rather than Christus, just one letter difference. But it's a one-to-one match if you look at it as this is about Christus. It matches perfectly. So I think that's very important, and to me it's obvious this is talking about the same issue. It's because it is the same expulsion of Jews, same date, and the only thing that varies is the source. So Jesus Christ was preached. It got the Jews uppity, and that caused Rome to expel the Jews. So moving on, you have Celsus. He's a Neoplatonist philosopher from the late 2nd century. That word's a mouthful, quite hard to pronounce sometimes. He wrote a full-scale attack on Christianity, which he entitled True Doctrine. In this work, Celsus effectively acknowledges the miracles of Jesus. He actually talks about Jesus, and he acknowledges that he performed miraculous divine works. But what he argues is that Jesus Christ was a sorcerer, or a magician. And interestingly, this claim that Jesus was a sorcerer or a magician that Celsus raises, it was also made by disbelieving Jewish people. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 24, in Mark chapter 3, verse 22, and Luke chapter 11, verse 15. There is a writing to that effect in the Talmud as well. And while there is a level of controversy induced, it is weighty that the most ancient writers acknowledge the works of Jesus, that he did miraculous healings and such. He did miracle works, but They apparently, some of his opponents, like Celsus here, decided to attribute it to sorcery or trickery, or kind of magician magic hat tricks, right? And so that's another writing that corroborates Jesus. And we would just say that he was mistaken about the source of Jesus' power, but right, that Jesus lived and did miracles. So there's yet another writer outside the Bible that corroborates it. Now we have another writer, Lucian of Samosata, who around 165 CE or AD wrote a book called The Death of Peregrinus. And in this book he basically blames the ruin of Peregrinus on Christians. Why? Is because Christians are coming and they're evangelizing and they're saying, turn from all these pagan gods, all these Roman gods, to the one true God, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh of the Hebrews, and you worship him through Jesus Christ, through his Son. And now that means an incredible abandonment is happening of the pagan deities, and there's an entire economy built on the pagan deities because there's statuettes and idols that are sold, there's incense to be burned to them, sacrifices and temples that revolve around them, priests that live off the service to those pagan gods. So you can imagine that there's some people that are losing money, but not just that. Now you have the people that genuinely believe these pagan gods are real gods that uphold the order of the universe. So if you're causing them to be forsaken, oh, well, this earthquake that happened here, that must be because the gods are angry that you're causing us to forsake their worship. That mudslide must have been because the gods are angry that you're causing us to forsake their worship, and so on and so forth. So once you have that mindset plugged in that tragedies and bad things happening are all because the gods are displeased, and the gods are displeased because the Christians are causing a preaching against the pagan gods, now you can easily say, let's blame Christians for the decline of this place called Peregrinus. So that's what Lucian exactly does, and that's the exact mindset he takes it. So because of what the Christians did, he gets upset at them. Now, at one point, Lucian refers to Jesus Christ as that other whom the Christians still worship, the man who was crucified in Israel because he introduced this new cult into the world. That's his exact words. So even Lucian acknowledges that Christians in 165 CE, that early, they are still worshiping Jesus Christ as a God man, as God who became man, was crucified and was resurrected and ascended back to heaven. They are worshiping him as to a God. So Josephus Flavius is probably my favorite, probably most people's favorite out of all of these historians, just because his writings are just so extremely detailed and prolific. And then it corroborates the New Testament in so many ways. So Josephus Flavius, he's a first century Jewish historian, and he consequently writes about the first century and events in it and around it. And one of the major passages which refers to, it's called the James passage. It actually speaks about James, the brother of Jesus, who was noted in the New Testament to be the head or the Nasi of the Council of the Messianic Jews or Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. Josephus Flavius writes about him, and he wrote, quote, "When therefore Ananus the high priest was of this angry disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership council of judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, Yeshua, who was called Christ, whose name, the brother, was James." That's in Jewish Antiquities 20.9.1. So again, it confirms the existence of Jesus, and it assumes that the audience is likely to know about him, proving that he was already famed all over. That he refers to James as the biological brother of Jesus is significant also, because it also confirms Paul the Apostle's mention of James, the brother of Jesus, which entails that Paul viewed Jesus as a recent contemporary, since Paul speaks of his brother James also as a recent contemporary. So the passage forces the question of how this first century Jew, Jesus, could have arisen to the status of God manifested while his own brother and disciples were still alive. In other words, how can Jesus, who has a fleshly brother named James, a brother of the same mother, be worshipped as God is worshipped in the same time that his brother and other siblings were still alive? It would force you to contend with that question. Now, the New Testament explains that Jesus was conceived of the Holy Spirit, not of Mary being intimate with Joseph, but the other brothers would be total genealogical offspring of Joseph, Mary's husband. So, which does not speak well for the idea of the doctrine of perpetual virginity of Mary, but that's a different issue and conversation entirely. Nevertheless, it's important to note that there was still, Jesus was famous and was elevated in the eyes of people as God, while his brother in the flesh was still alive. That's pretty powerful. And you've got to keep in mind the context of the first century Judea. This would have been viewed as blasphemy by most, deserving of death to the Jews, which understanding certainly would have been factory installed. So to speak of James as he grew up attending synagogue, learning the Torah, especially Paul of Tarsus, who is Shaul, who studied under the esteemed Gamaliel, and then to say this declaration of this exalted status upon Jesus, to be a myth or legend invented by these same men and perpetuated by them in spite of their very strict and disciplined Jewish upbringing, one must then ask why they were willing to face such torture, persecution, and death from all sides to perpetuate this idea that Jesus was God who visited them in human flesh. Would you die for it when your native culture already taught you to be hostile to these kind of ideas? It's not likely. It doesn't make sense, right? So you'd think it more reasonable to believe they actually did see the resurrected, risen Jesus, and that caused them to change their minds, especially considering the brother James would have been among the brothers who were at first resistant to Jesus' testimony of who he was. We see that in the gospel. So I want to give you more, though. Now, we have the Babylonian Talmud. We also have Talmud Yerushalmi, but most don't read the Jerusalem Talmud. Most read the Babylonian Talmud. I haven't gone over both of these in detail to see always where they match up and what stories are in and what stories are out. But I'm familiar with the stories about Jesus in the Babylonian Talmud. And now they may not attribute good things to Jesus, but it is another historical record. So, of course, the Talmud is the written form of the oral traditions, which is laws mostly, various mitzvot and Torot of the Pharisaic Jewish community. But it's also the oral tradition for, should we say, the testimonies of history and what happened and what was happening back in those days, etc., etc. And now, of course, this eventually came to be codified in a written format, the Talmud, as time passed out of necessity, but for a long time it's in oral form. So the Babylonian Talmud, and again, it's this historical compilation of rabbinical commentary on application of matters of debate of the laws of Moses, Jewish history. It was put together by the descendants of the persuasion of the rabbinic Pharisaic Jews who survived the destruction of the Second Temple desolation in Jerusalem by Romans forces. And obviously they were hostile to Yeshua, Jesus, and did not believe he was the Messiah. Well, the same Talmud, it reports this in Tractate Sanhedrin 43a, and it says, Yeshua, who they call Yeshu as an insult, apparently, dropping the A, from what I'm told. Or, well, it's not really an A, it would be the Hebrew, but Yeshua was hanged on Passover Eve. 40 days previously, the herald had cried, "He is being led out for stoning because he has practiced sorcery and led Israel astray and enticed them to apostasy. Whoever has anything to say in Yeshua's defense, Jesus' defense, let him come and declare it." As nothing was brought forward in his defense, he was hanged on Passover Eve. So the Babylonian Talmud, it was composed between 500 to 600 AD, as I said, of those oral traditions. So this is interesting to see. Take a look here and note that they're saying Jesus practiced sorcery and led Israel astray with sorcery and magic. Well, we saw that earlier. This is the same thing that was claimed by an earlier writer that I spoke of. Was that Pliny? No. Celsus. It was Celsus. So Celsus wrote this as well and made this claim as well. So that's interesting to see that the rabbis of the Talmud have this same claim in common with Celsus. So but think of how important this is, okay? Orthodox Jews, Pharisaic Jews, rabbinical Jews, do not believe Jesus is Messiah, do not believe Jesus is Son of God. They resist Jesus, they resist his followers and delegitimize him. And they are acknowledging that Yeshua, Jesus, did exist, did live in the first century, and did perform miraculous works. They're not saying he didn't do miraculous works, but they're just saying he did it by demons, by the power of demons, by the power of Beelzebub, which is abominable to say. But think about this. If you're a Jewish person, wouldn't it be more advantageous to discredit Jesus by saying he had no power at all? Either that he did exist, but there was no miraculous powers, there was no healed lepers and blind people receiving their sight. Wouldn't it make more sense to discredit his miraculous power, or else even deny outright that he existed at all? But that's not what the rabbis do. In the Talmud, they acknowledge he existed, they acknowledge he had power, and they just reattribute the source of the power to the demonic realm and to sorcery, magic, and witchcraft, instead of to the actual power of God. And so you've got to stop and think about that. That's an actually hugely powerful testimony, because that functions as a hostile witness. Because in the modern era, the hyper-skeptical secularist, they're contesting even whether Jesus existed or not, and things like that at points, not all of them. And this is not accusative to you, the watcher. I'm just saying that in an era with such radical skepticism, it's quite powerful that enemies of Jesus and the religion of Jesus have every agenda to deny that he even existed or to deny that he had any power, acknowledge both that he existed and had miraculous powers. So that's hugely impactful, hugely important, and very, very powerful extra biblical corroboration coming from rabbinic Judaism, whether they willed it or not, actually helping the case. So the miraculous works of Jesus, they're actually confirmed in rabbinic writings, and it's just only the source of power that's questioned. That is absolutely amazing. This also corroborates the gospel, which said this same language, this does appear in the gospel. It goes very far back, showing that there's a causal relationship, that obviously it was said before, so the people passed it down to their descendants of, say, the anti-messianic rabbinic segment of Jews. So in Matthew chapter 12, verses 23 and 24, it says, "The crowds were all amazed and asked of Jesus, could this be the son of David? But the Pharisees, the Parashim, when they heard this, said, it is only by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, that this fellow casts out demons." So it's literally in the Talmud, the Orthodox rabbis, they're making the exact same accusation that the ancient rabbis did way back then. And so that is incredibly validating to the narrative of the gospel, to the narrative of the New Testament. So I think that's hugely impactful as a testimony. So that's mostly it for the New Testament and the writers I've chronicled from various sources that have written about these. But there is a lot of stuff that goes to the Old Testament as well. I've mentioned many times on the reliability of the Old Testament by Kenneth Kitchen, the Zondervan Handbook of Biblical Archaeology. These are powerful books to have. But there's another called the Fragments of Berossus. And it's from the 3rd century BC. And it actually goes over events that corroborate the history of the Tower of Babel, the flood of Noah, and various other events of history. So that's another interesting one you can look at. And you've got more. Let's see. You've got an ancient Greek historian named Megasthenes, who he wrote of a concept of God that very closely matches what the gospel portrays. I believe it's centuries earlier. 350 BC. It's called the Hermetic Creed. It speaks of a supreme deity that's before all things that really exist. In the beginning, one God prior to the first God and the ruler of the world, immovable, solitude in solitude and in his unity. Just a supreme being who is called the only Father, the self-begotten God. There might be slight variance here, so I don't want to get too into this right now, because it's been a while since I have gone through these notes, but this just shows that there's history to the idea. I'm not saying Jesus and his followers copied a pre-existing idea, by the way, even if this comes first. I'm saying there was already a spiritual movement going back, asserting things very much to the flavor of how Jesus has been portrayed, or portrayed himself in his relationship in regards to God the Father. So, at any rate, those fragments, they also mention Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, and they also mention Manetho. There's mention of Manetho, the high priest and scribe of Adida in Egypt. And so he wrote sort of an Egyptian chronicle of the Egyptian kings, and he mentions the times of the Hyksos. Now, there's a lot of debate on the Hyksos. These are shepherd kings, so they are definitely Semitic, is what we know. They might be Israel, they might not be Israel. No one's saying they're Israel. There's many cases that they're not, but they could be, and it's interesting to see that the mention of the Hyksos is a kind of Bedouin shepherd tribe. It might be the Ishmaelites, the offspring of Abraham, who did not receive the covenant of God, but it is interesting that a source to turn to for history that sometimes corroborates events pertaining to Israel, and in some places it's pretty potent what's reported, because they do describe these guys as kind of monotheistic and tearing down their idols, which is, it really sure does sound like an Israelite thing to do, I've got to be honest. So fragments of Berossus, that's pretty important to look at. You've got the fragments of the Tyrian Annals from Dias of Hiram, which mention the Solomon of king of Jerusalem, who sent enigmas to Hieronymus, like some kind of riddles, a popular thing among kings to do, to test their wits and sort of basically gamble. If you can solve this riddle, I'll give you money, but if you don't solve it, you pay me. And they'd play games with each other, right? So you have this as well, and so on and so forth. So we've got a lot of powerful sources outside the Bible that give weight to it, and that's what I wanted to cover in this video and just add to the case that I've already been making in other videos. That's it for today. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello everyone, Eric McRae here. I do want to say that if you do feel moved to send me a donation to contribute to the growth of this ministry, you may feel free to do so by sending e-transfers to the following email. That's eric_mccrae@hotmail.com. Again, eric_mccrae@hotmail.com. The spelling you can see on the screen. If you send an e-transfer there, it'll go directly to me and bypasses any need of other transactional fees with other platforms. So I never expect donations, but any donations I do receive, I greatly appreciate. Regardless, it's my pleasure to serve you in providing all the information that I can that will help you in your spiritual growth. God bless you, and see you next time.